has a straight edge on it, so it's very easy. And maybe in our world here, there lives a happy little mountain.
Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel. And today's video I'm going to be doing something different. I'm starting off sort of a different type of content on my channel because obviously whenever I can, upload sort of my Unsolved Sundays where I, discuss my research into sort of solved and unsolved true crime videos, but I wanted to expand that a little bit into just a larger area of things that I really enjoy talking about and hopefully you guys find fascinating as well. So today's video is going to be solely based on something called the Stanford Prison Experiment, which is probably something that a lot of you guys are familiar with, especially since very recently there was a film that was released that was kind of focused on the entire experiment, the whole everything surrounding it. And so if it's something you kind of find interesting, then definitely, if you haven't already watched that, it's definitely worth a watch. So basically the Stanford Prison Experiment was a psychological study, and it's something that I came across during my psychology studies at A-level, and then throughout uni it's sort of something that's like a core piece of research that everyone refers to because it is quite influential, but it's also very controversial because of the way things went about. So I thought I'd discuss it because it is a very strange study, and there's a lot of good things behind it. The intentions were pure and good, but a lot of things went wrong, which obviously I will discuss. So I will just get started. Right, so I want to apologise very quickly if any point in this video my face goes a little bit red or flushed, or my chest does as well. It's very warm in here because there's a road outside, so I have to close the window, I have to close the door, so in order to prevent any sort of background noise I have to make it like a little hot box in here, so it's very warm, so I'm sorry if you see anything like that on me. This experiment began in 1973 when a psychologist named Dr. Zimbardo set out to kind of investigate the links between authority figures and obedience rates and basically personality types, conformity rates, things like that within a prison environment. The overall aim of the study was to sort of identify whether aggression within prison environments was down to the individual personality types of the authority members, like the independent individual factors affecting them. So some people have a certain personality type that might be more aggressive and things like that, or whether it was a result of simply the prison environment itself, so whether external factors within the prison environment were encouraging this aggression towards prisoners on behalf of prison guards. Now, the way that Zimbardo decided to carry out this study, rather than going into an actual prison and sort of observing things, because there are a lot of things kind of wrong with that, sometimes things aren't always 100% true when a study is being carried out. So for example, in a prison it could be that prisoners are more well behaved or less well behaved if they know they're being watched by a psychologist. So there's loads of different factors. So the way Zimbardo chose to carry out this study was through kind of mimicking. He created or replicated what he believed was a realistic prison environment in the basement of the Stanford University Psychology Department. So he set up this whole prison. There was a corridor with all these rooms. There were 3 cells. They were obviously just rooms, but there were 6 by 9 foot cells where there would be 3 sort of camp beds in each cell for prisoners. There were very little inside these rooms. There were 3 camp beds in each cell, and that was it. They were very small, very cramped. Again, the aim was sort of to replicate a prison room. There were a few rooms away, sort of out the sight of the prisoners' cells, which were to be used by the guards. So when the guards were off duty, they had a room there where they would sit and sleep and things like that, just sort of out of sight of the prisoners' cells. There was a small cupboard-shaped or sized room that was used as the solitary confinement area, where if a prisoner was deemed to be disobedient, or if he wasn't listening, if he was basically anything that needed to be punished, he would be put in this solitary confinement because it was small and cramped and it wasn't really a very nice place to be. And there was also another small room just down the corridor that was labelled as the prison yard that acted sort of as their exercise. The experiment is advertised on the Stanford University campus for volunteers to take part in a study which would investigate the psychological effects of prison environments. So that's kind of all they were told, and in total around 70 volunteers came forward. Then they narrowed down these 70 volunteers. They looked at people who, whether they had like psychological conditions, which case they were removed from the list, if they had any drug history, if they had any criminal history, and as well as if they had any sort of medical issue, any sort of medical disability, anything like that. So all of those factors were taken into account, and if any of them had any of those, they were removed from the volunteer list, which ultimately left them with a total of 24 participants. Each of these participants, like I said, were volunteers from the Stanford University campus. They were all male students. They were also offered a fee of $15 per day that they took part in the experiment, so they had some sort of compensation or some sort of reason to take part in this study. If anyone's sort of wondering why they take part in the study, they had money. So from the participant list, people were randomly assigned to one of two roles. They were either assigned the role of a prisoner or the role of a prison guard. And after they did so, there were two non-assigned participants. One of them ultimately dropped out once he was told that he hadn't been assigned a role and he was more of a reserve. So this ultimately left them with a total of 10 prisoners and 11 prison guards. So one big issue, one of the number of big issues surrounding this experiment, was that the participants taking part in this weren't fully told sort of the extent to which the prison environment would be kind of carried out, how realistic it would be, including just how realistic their arrest would be. So they weren't informed that they would actually be arrested outside their homes. So actual uniformed police officers one day just turned up at their homes, handcuffed them in front of their family and neighbours, and took them in the back of a police car down to the local police station. So this in itself was unexpected and extremely traumatic for people who, you know, didn't know it was happening, hadn't told their family it was happening, all of this. It was very traumatic, and that was just sort of the beginning.
And then what we did is we told the guards come down a day early, and we had them pick their own uniform. We had them help set up the prison so they'd feel like it was their prison, and the prisoners were coming into their place. The prisoners, we simply said, wait at home or in the dormitories. Well, what we didn't tell them, which is a little bit of the deception of omission, is that they were arrested by the city police.
Right there, they took me out the door, they put my hands against the car. It was a real cop car, it was a real policeman. They took me to the police station, the basement of the police station.
I had told the policemen to put a blindfold on the prisoners, but since they had never been arrested, they didn't know that doesn't happen. The reason for the blindfold is then my assistants would come, put him in our car, bring him down to our prison.
So once they were handcuffed and placed in the back of these police cars, they were driven down to the local police station where they were fingerprinted, they had their photos taken, they were placed into the system like any other criminal. As, like I said, the whole point of this was for the experiment to be as realistic as possible. Once they'd taken them to the police station and taken all their details, they were then blindfolded again, handcuffed and put in the back of a car again, and then they were driven to the prison, which obviously was just in the basement of the Stanford University Psychology Department. But because these participants didn't know this, they knew it was a fake environment, but they didn't know where they were being driven, so it was all, again, quite traumatic experience. Upon arriving in the prison, the prisoners were stripped naked, deloused, they had any of their personal possessions just removed from their persons. They were given uniforms, which were literally just a smock with their prisoner number on, a tight cap to wear, no underwear, and they also had a chain tied around one of their ankles. And they were given a prisoner number, and they were told to only refer to each other and themselves by their prisoner number. And the whole point of all of this, the uniforms, the prisoner number, was to begin this process of de-individuation. So basically removing any sense of personal identity to make them conform to this role of being a prisoner, just to obviously observe the effects of that and how quickly it would actually take them to conform to these roles. Those who'd been randomly selected to play the role of the prison guards, they were also given uniforms. They were slightly less sort of dehumanising. They were just khaki uniforms, like shirt, trousers. They had whistles around their necks. They had batons. They also had to wear sunglasses. They were informed to wear sunglasses as a way of sort of avoiding and never making eye contact with prisoners, again to sort of further this effect of dehumanisation and de-individuation, because they were treated like prisoners. The guards worked in 8-hour shifts in groups of 3, so while 3 were on guard watching the prisoners, the other 3 would be in the sort of prison guard break room, I guess, in a way, resting, and then they'd be called in and they'd switch like a general work schedule. They were pretty much given free reign of the prison. They were told that physical violence was not permitted, and also basically their main aim was to gain the respect and control of the prisoners by whatever means that they feel necessary, and to just maintain law and order within their prison. And it was at this point that the observation of the behaviours of both groups of people began. Now, surprisingly, it didn't take long for both groups to conform to their roles, because obviously the environment was so realistic, the way it was created and carried out. It didn't take long for the guards to become assertive and authoritative, looking down on the prisoners, treating them like prisoners, and it also didn't take the prisoners long to become submissive to these guards. And it was kind of shocking at the time, realising just how quickly we conform to these roles. So on day one in the prison experiment, at around 2:30 a.m, the group of guards on call, they woke up the prisoners with the first of what they called counts. They woke them up from their sleep, what little sleep they'd had on these uncomfortable beds in this strange environment and this traumatic experience, by blowing whistles in their ears to just suddenly wake them up and give them a fright. And then they carried out what they called counts, which from what I can understand is kind of just a whole load of activities just to sort of encourage the prisoners to embrace their new identity. So like, they'd call out their prison number, they'd tell them to yell it back to them in their line, they'd stand them out in the corridor and shout at them to yell out their prison number, things like that. It was sort of the guards' role to reinforce these social roles. So there were a few prisoners at first that did not quite obey as much as the others. As you'll see if you see any sort of clips of it, there are a few in day one that sort of are a little bit more like, oh, this is only an experiment, but the majority did conform, because all they saw were these other strange men shouting at them with batons and whistles and basically having control over their entire day, their routine. They had access to their cells, they had no privacy, so they did conform to being submissive to these guards. And because of the authority that the prison guards actually had, they immediately began dishing out any sort of punishments they thought necessary. So it would be anything from doing exercises if they didn't conform, or being put in solitary confinement, anything like that, just as a way of them also reinforcing the authority that they needed to make sure they had over the prisoners. There were even times where prisoners sort of told tales of other prisoners to the guards, just in hopes of them receiving some sort of reward or special treatment. And again, this just reinforces this whole conformity and obedience. Pretty much throughout their experience in this prison, prisoners were taunted with these meaningless, dehumanising tasks that again were there to not only keep the prisoners submissive, but also to keep the guards dominant. And these were all dished out, bearing in mind they weren't being instructed by the experimenters throughout this. The experimenters pretty much just sat back and watched. So all of this was being done, it was kind of coming unfolding naturally. The guards were doing what they thought they should do and what they wanted to do, and it was all this is why it was so controversial, because all of this, they weren't being told to do any of it. So the first day kind of passed without anything too dramatic happening, which then meant on day two, when a rebellion broke out, it became sort of more surprising to the guards, it was more unsuspecting, and it was all quite, unexpected. So in the early morning of day two, prisoners began to rebel against the guards. They barricaded themselves into their cells, they removed their caps and their prisoner numbers, they used their beds to sort of shut the doors, and basically just formed any rebellion they could. And then very quickly, the guards on duty, they called the guards that were on break and immediately began to gain control again of the situation. It didn't take long for them to just jump into action and demand this authority back. So they were shouting at the prisoners, they used a fire extinguisher, firing it through the cell windows to get the prisoners away from the cell doors. They broke into the cells, and they eventually actually stripped the prisoners of their clothes. Again, all these sort of dehumanising, aggressive acts that the guards were doing of their own accord to try and gain authority.
And they said, we have to treat force with force, so they broke down the doors. Stripped the prisoners naked, dragged them out. Some of them, they tied up their feet. They put them in solitary confinement, which was a tiny little hole in a closet, about this big, dark. And they said, at this point, everything but breathing air is a privilege.
As a punishment for the rebellion, they removed the beds from the cells, and obviously, like I said, they stripped them of their clothes. So they immediately had this form of punishment, again, to regain their authority. They also chose to place those who they believed to be the ringleaders of the rebellion, so sort of the ones that were the most involved, in the solitary confinement and make sort of made an example of them and placed them publicly in this solitary confinement. And like I said, I'm going to have to keep stressing, because of the nature of this study, it was an observational piece of research. All of this was seemingly being done of their own accord, because obviously, as we find out later on, they weren't doing it because they were nasty people. It's this whole conformity to their role. The guards took it upon themselves at this point to designate what they called the privileged cell. So they placed beds in there, and basically the prisoners that they deemed to be the least involved in the rebellion, they got special privileges, and they were allowed in this cell. They were allowed to sleep in their beds, wash their hair, brush their teeth, things like that. So they basically gave a reward and punishment system. They developed it themselves, this whole system, as once again a way to maintain their authority. I know I keep saying it, but obviously that is the whole point of this. Following the rebellion, in day 3, it became more apparent that both the guards and the prisoners were sort of adopting their roles even more, and the relationships between them became more prominent. They just noticed it more and more. So it was though, sort of by the end of day 2, we saw like that the prisoners had become submissive again, the prison guards had gained control once again, as they had started off with. And then after this, in day 3, the prisoners became even more submissive and dependent on the prison guards. And the more they did that, it seemed that some guards in particular seemed to use it as a way to dehumanise them even more. They almost took enjoyment out of it. Again, I have to stress, not because of the nasty people, but obviously I'll explain it at the end. And you can read a lot into it. I'm literally just here, I probably should have said this at the start, I'm literally just here to sort of talk through the actual experiment itself. So there were some guards in particular that the experimenters took note of that would be even more mocking towards the prisoners, the more submissive and dependent they became.
And then a very interesting thing happened. Dave Eshelman, who the prisoners named John Wayne, like he's a Wild West cowboy, he begins to be more extreme.
I decided that I would become the worst, most intimidating, cruel prison guard that I could possibly be.
I see in the future that you do work when you're told. Say it again. Say bless you, correction officer.
I was sort of fascinated myself that people were believing the act, and I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough, stop.
Just under 36 hours into the study, a prisoner known as prisoner 8612 began to show signs of what was called acute emotional disturbance. He was found to be crying uncontrollably. They couldn't console him. His thoughts were sort of all over the place. He was acting really irrationally, and he was just begging to go home, basically. He was taken away to speak to the guards about his condition, about how he wanted to leave the study, but then he was only to return back to the prisoners, and he was recorded saying, "You can't leave, you can't quit." And this seemed to just make his condition even more extreme. So he became visibly stressed. He was hysterical, crying in fits of rage. They couldn't control him. He just was not conforming anymore, and it was showing. It was at this point that the psychologists needed to have a discussion, so they decided to, as a way of sort of calming the prisoners down a little bit, to sort of reduce this psychological harm that was being, put on these prisoners, they would have in the following day an hour's sort of family and friends visiting time. So they'd invite family and friends to see the prisoners for an hour. Now, the guards were fearful of the family and friends coming and visiting the prisoners, seeing the conditions they were in, and wanting and demanding to remove them from the study because they knew that it wasn't a safe environment. So to avoid doing that, the guards took it upon themselves to help them clean the entire prison. They washed the prisoners, they fed them well, they played music for them, they did all these things just to sort of keep the prisoners happy and in a better place, and kind of create the illusion that they weren't under as much stress and everything as they actually were. It wasn't long after the visiting hour ended that a rumour began to circulate that a mass escape plan had been unfolding amongst all of the prisoners. For fear of losing the prisoners, because obviously it wasn't an actual prison, so they probably would have found a way to get out, the guards worked in collaboration with the experimenters, who also got the local police department involved, as a way of keeping the prisoners in the prison. And upon hearing of the plan for this mass escape that the prisoners were plotting, the guards then took it upon themselves to up the ante with the aggression levels. So they then decided to make them all do really demeaning tasks, like they had to clean the toilets with their bare hands and just things like that. So it was kind of like once again they were doing whatever they could to maintain their authority. So now on to day 4 and 5. Day 4, Zimbardo decided to call in a Catholic priest because he had previously worked in a prison, and he decided that he would get him to come in and sort of give his assessment on whether he believed that the prison environment that Zimbardo had created was realistic enough for the study to work, because like I said, he'd had experience working in prisons before. And one of the really strange things that was noted in the experiment was that when the priest came into this prison and introduced himself to each of the prisoners, the majority of the prisoners actually introduced themselves to the priest by their prisoner number and not their real names, which just goes to show the extent to which these participants were maintaining these social roles. The priest interviewed each of the prisoners individually, kind of got a sense of the place. He was basically working as a prison chaplain, and he kind of spoke to each of them about their experiences just to gather proper insight into the entire environment. And if any of the prisoners actually asked him about, you know, how they get out of it because they want to leave the experiment, all he did was tell them, as you know, someone in that position would in a normal sort of prison, that the only way they'd be able to get out of prison is by enlisting the help of a lawyer. So once again, another member who was trying to create this realistic as possible environment, but was only just encouraging this psychological harm even more, because they felt like they had no way out of this experiment that they should have been able to withdraw themselves from at any point. Prisoner number 819 actually broke down when he had his interview with the priest, and he was just in hysterics, he was crying, he was freaking out, and this was actually the same as the 2 previous prisoners that had had an interview with the priest before prisoner 819. After seeing sort of how distressed he was in this environment, the experimenters decided to step in, and they came into this room, they took off his chain around his ankle, they took off his cap, and they told him to go and lie down and take some rest in one of the empty cell rooms. They told him that they'd get a doctor because he'd had sort of other physical symptoms. He'd had broken out in a whole rash. Like I said, he was just in hysterics and he was just visibly distressed. So they told him they'd get a doctor to him as soon as they could, and also they'd get him some food. So they told him just to go and have some rest and they will sort it. The prisoner did as he was told, but as he was sort of resting, waiting for the experimenters to come back with the doctor that they promised, the other guards had managed to get all of the other prisoners lined up in the corridor outside the cell room he was lying down in, and they started to tell them to chant these things like, prisoner number 819 is a bad prisoner. Because of what prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess, Mr. Correctional Officer. So they were chanting this. Each of the prisoners were shouting this out, and this poor distressed participant was just lying down and he could hear all of these chants, getting really distressed because they were blaming him for everything. When the experimenters returned, they quickly saw just how distressed he was, because he could hear these chants. He was sobbing hysterically, so the psychologists just said to him, look, you can leave the experiment, it's okay. And he responded with, no, I can't, because all of the other prisoners and the guards think they've labelled me as a bad prisoner. So even given the opportunity, he had conformed to the social role to the extent that he felt like he couldn't leave because he had to be a good prisoner. So it was at this point that Zimbardo himself stepped in, and there's a quote here of him, what he said to prisoner 819, or the man who was known as prisoner 819. So Zimbardo said to him, listen, you are not number 819, you are his name. And my name is Dr. Zimbardo. I'm a psychologist, not a prison superintendent, and this is not a real prison. This is just an experiment, and those are students, not prisoners, just like you. Let's go. And after hearing this, the prisoners stopped crying and they left. Day 6 was the final day of the experiment. Now, bearing in mind, Zimbardo cancelled the experiment on this day, but he'd originally set out at the start of the experiment to have it as a 2-week-long experiment. So that shows just how kind of badly it went. In the span of less than 6 days, how much distress and how conditions, they just completely disintegrated. It was absolutely dreadful. So on the 6th day, he had to end the experiment. There was a doctor, and she'd just recently gained her PhD from Stanford Uni. She came in as a means of just sort of interviewing the prisoners, getting an understanding of the whole environment again, and she actually came out of the interviews going, like, she was in absolute hysterics about how dreadful the conditions were and how it was immoral and how he shouldn't be doing this to these prisoners. And obviously that was the final straw for Zimbardo. He realised just how bad the experiment had gotten, and she herself even said about Zimbardo that he himself had gotten so far into this prison role that he was you know, taking up. He was also in this environment, so he had conformed to a fake prison role, that he was too deep, and it took him too long to realise just how deep he was, that he was putting these participants at risk. So ultimately this experiment did technically show what it set out to show. It showed that people will conform to social roles that they are given, and they will obey to people with authority over them, which, like I said, Zimbardo had intended to examine. And it kind of does show that the obedience is the strongest when those with the authority fit kind of a predetermined stereotype in everyone's mind. So for example, in this case, the prison guards were aggressive, like most prison guards at the time were seen to be. They kitted them out in uniform that was very stereotypical, so all of this. So it just kind of shows that stereotypical authoritarian figures lead to obedience of those with less authority than them. And then the behaviours of the prisoners and the guards can be explained by the process of de-individuation. So it wasn't actually the individual people acting this way, that, like I keep saying, they aren't nasty or horrible or aggressive people, but because they were fitting to this role that they'd been given, they lost all sense of personal responsibility and personal identity, and they were acting as almost as a group or as a role. So as you probably figured out, this study is considered one of the most controversial psychological experiments in history, because the way things were carried out and just how badly it went. So yes, it did show what it had intended to show, but there are a number of like ethical guidelines mostly that it broke, that in nowadays standards, the guidelines that psychologists have to follow, it wouldn't have met any of those standards. So you have to bear in mind that at the time it was conducted, the guidelines weren't as strict, and there are guidelines nowadays in place for reasons like this, because the intention of psychologists should be to protect their participants from harm. It should be to tell them everything that will be expected of them. There's a whole list of guidelines that psychologists have to follow, and obviously this experiment did not follow them. So for example, if you take into account that the psychologists weren't fully aware of what they were going to encounter, so they didn't know just how realistic the prison environment was going to be, just how badly they'd be treated, you know, they didn't know they'd be arrested, all of this, they weren't fully informed of half of this stuff. Zimbardo himself didn't protect the prisoners or the prison guards from any physical or psychological harm. There were fights that broke out, and the psychological harm will be extensive. The most obvious psychological harm will be suffered from the prisoners, because like I said, they were so dehumanized, they were treated so badly that that's obviously going to stick with them. But also some of the prison guards, you can imagine, I'm sure they came out with psychological harm as well, because of the way that they treated other people in this experiment as this role. So in the defense of Zimbardo, obviously I wouldn't condone any of this, like I'm not here to place my opinion, I'm just obviously stating the facts. So in defense of Zimbardo, the behaviours that were seen and demonstrated throughout the experiment, there was no way they could have predicted any of these outcomes, because like I said, none of it was instructed. It was all carried out of the prisoners and the guards' own accord. They just naturally, in a way, kind of in a sense, I'm not sure if that's the right word to use, but that's how it unfolded, and there weren't anyone sort of whispering behind the scenes, like telling the guards what to do. It all just unfolded like that, and they had no way of predicting that. But there are so many things wrong with this. Just the harm alone to these poor people that had no idea what they were going into makes it sort of one of the most controversial and dramatic psychological experiments that has ever been conducted. So that's everything I'm going to discuss today. If it's something that's interests you, like I said, there are loads of videos online. I'm sure if you just search the Stanford Prison Experiment into YouTube, there are loads of clips, and also there is the film that was created recently that I'm sure you can find somewhere. So definitely look into it. There is a lot, and I'm sure if any of you are going into like A-level psychology, most likely you will come across this to do with obedience. It's a huge pinnacle when you're studying psychology. It's a huge deal because, like I said, there are so many debates around it, but it has provided a lot of knowledge into certain factors in the way we behave to do with obedience and authority, in probably the most controversial manner. So yes, that is everything I'm going to discuss. Hope you guys found this interesting. Let me know down below anything you want me to discuss, anything interesting, anything like this, like psychological experiments, anything to do with psychology if you want. Like, if you're new here, you probably won't know, but I study psychology at uni. So anything like that, any conspiracy theories, missing persons cases, anything like that. It all interests me, and that's kind of the direction I'm taking my channel in from now on. So yes, hope you found this interesting. Leave your requests down below, and I'll see you guys soon for another video. Bye!